We continue with part 2 of the psychology of abuse with a look at emotional abuse, its common manifestations, and its impact on men. And there are a lot of things, women and men who end up in casualty. We are going to talk about, men, because when we talk about abuse and violence, it's oftentimes children and women that we talk about as victims.
Yes.
But men too
Yeah.
suffer abuse and violence.
Forgive me saying this, I sound a little bit weird, but there are a lot of organizations that focus on women and children, and they largely focus on the violent end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
So they get their statistics from crime figures and all the rest of it. They almost always ignore the psychological aspects of abuse. Women are vastly better at that than men. So a man is almost always psychologically abused, and there'll be some element of violence. It's the other way around more often with women.
Yeah.
And men, of course, if they are being violently abused, who can they tell?
Yeah.
You try going to the police station, you're not going to be well received.
No, if anything,
And
they're
there are
probably
no
going to be laughed at and lectured. How do you let this happen in your house?
And your dad will say something similar, and
Yeah.
all your friends will say something similar. It's very hard for men in that situation, especially because the abuse is likely to be, showing no scars. The guy is getting completely bitter and twisted, and he doesn't know who to turn to.
Now that we've skated into psychological abuse, let's define that. Walk us through what that's like, because it's not physical, but it's things that are happening that beat you down mentally.
Yeah.
So what are some of the things that people do that constitute psychological abuse?
There's a big range of possibilities.
Let's just talk about a few.
Yeah,
Common
what I
ones.
mean is that people are quite many and varied and subtle, A common one, for example, is taking control. Gradually you begin to realize that your world is shrinking, that I'm a bit funny about your friends, and I don't like you going to see your mum. And I keep saying ever such charming things like, don't go out tonight, let's stay in and have some quality time. It all sounds like it's going in the right direction.
Right.
But gradually you realize your life's
You have no
becoming
friends.
small. You have no
Yes.
friends. Another type of abuse is you're being restricted in your choice of work. Maybe you're being encouraged not to work. Maybe your interests, your hobbies, all these things are gradually diminished. Maybe your coming and going is getting monitored, Anytime you're away from the house, you get 48 messages.
Yeah. Where are you?
Endless phone calls.
You didn't tell me you were leaving.
And when are you coming back? And, controlling.
Right.
I think you can imagine that initially that actually feels quite nice.
Oh, he
He
cares.
cares, he loves me. And it's always expressed like that.
Yes.
It's not nice at all.
It's only in the later stages when it's, you are not allowed to go unless I say so.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. I think you can picture that as your world begins to diminish and you talk to less people, you get gradually more and more vulnerable. You are depending on this person more and more. He's probably by now the breadwinner, and he's probably got all the bank accounts, and you're existing on 20,000 a month, so it goes on. You don't, and your choices begin to be limited. Somehow you're not consulted, in financial decisions, and you gradually become a little doormat.
Right.
Not a very nice place. And another form of abuse is where it's me who's up to some mischief, and somehow I'm managing to convince you that you've got it all wrong. So I didn't say what you thought I said, and your memory of the event was completely different, and I totally convince you that you're nuts.
No.
Yeah, and I think you can imagine that's quite disturbing, because you end up sitting there thinking, I'm sure I remember that happening, and yet I've convinced you that it didn't. Or the reverse.
Or I'm sure you said that, but you've convinced me.
That I didn't hear it.
Yeah.
Or that I misinterpreted it, or I got it all completely twisted and wrong.
Yeah.
And so you really do end up thinking, gosh, I need to see a shrink,
And that psychological play on people is horrific. Someone once tried that on me many years ago when I was much younger, and I found him in the do with another girl. And so you run away and you lock them up in the room. You think you should have at least locked the room, something. And when he finally came to talk to me, the first thing he said was, "It's not what you saw." I'm telling you, doctor, he could have told me anything on the
Yep.
planet other
Yep.
than my eyes saw something that wasn't
Yep.
there. So I
But-
can only imagine years of that.
Yes, exactly. And imagine if it starts very subtly in small ways, and the first few times it happens, it's really quite plausible. And then gradually he's getting more and more subtle at it, and he's really working on your insecurities. And before you know it, you're completely
Yeah,
twisted.
he's going to tell you that house that we bought, we didn't buy, we were actually renting. And you believe that.
Absolutely. And the list can get endless. This has got a rather nice name, actually. It's called Gaslighting, from a 1940s film where that was the plot. This guy was driving his wife mad.
So this isn't a new concept.
No.
It's been
This is a
around for
very well
years.
established concept.
Better check what that man's telling you. What?
Yes,
That's
absolutely.
a frightening one.
And don't forget that women do it just as much as men.
Okay. Again,
Yeah, forgive me saying this.
it applies to both.
You know, even it's true that women are actually more violent in the home than men are.
Really?
But of course, what happens is that, first of all, there's a focus on the women. And secondly, of course, men are bigger than women, so the women are more likely to get injured. So the stats in the casualty departments, there's more women than men. And an awful lot of men turn up in casualty departments with stab wounds, for example, and say, I was in a bar brawl.
And
they
no.
won't admit that it was their wife.
It was mama who did it. Then again, that just takes us back to how people perceive
Yeah.
injuries on men and injuries
Yes.
on women,
Yeah.
and especially when perpetrated by the opposite gender.
Yeah.
Let's go back to childhood a little bit.
Okay.
Because we haven't fully exhausted the things that people learn and the things that people can and learn much later in life. But let's go back to something you were talking about, abuse and childhood.
Right.
In learning about these behaviors from the
Yes.
environment and our parents, and other things that also happen to kids.
Yes. I mean, everybody's sort of aware of the child that is being abused. And obviously that's horrible. And they tend to develop into the person who looks for an abuser. Their idea of family life is that it involves fists and...
There must
and
be abuse in there somewhere.
there's... Yeah, I don't know what to call it really, but it's what they become familiar with. And I'm afraid we go looking for the same thing in our relationships. So of course, as an adult, this person will say, oh, I had a terrible childhood. I'm going to make sure that doesn't happen to me now. But they go looking for the person who is likely to be just that person. Very, very nasty.
Yeah.
There's also the other end of the spectrum, though. I mean, you get an awful lot of children who are brought up in very permissive or even neglectful families, chaotic families, the sort of family where the child doesn't really know what the rules are, the sort of family where the child grows up very impulsive and very likely to lash out with its fists when things go wrong. Has never been taught, you know, to share with their siblings and all the other things. Now imagine that child becoming a teenager, now we're the gang member, we're the person who's going to start getting involved in crime and all the rest of it. And in due course, when we get involved in relationships, they're not going to be very nice.
No.
You see what I mean?
It's all about them.
Yeah.
Very narcissistic.
Yeah, it's not so much... There's a subset that are narcissists,
Right.
but I'm just talking about the
About
ones
the
that are
behavior,
chaotic.
exactly,
You know, the
okay.
ones who are impulsive and super sensitive. The ones who, you know, if I happen to bump into you going into the classroom at school, you did it deliberately.
Yeah,
And, you know,
just because I can.
and you can spot these people quite early, and the best schools, of course, grab them and start dealing with all of that. But the ones that don't get spotted, by the
Fall
time...
through the cracks.
Yeah, I mean, the long and short of it is that there's a lot of parenting issues in all of this. I mean, obviously, it's not a good idea to be a neglectful parent, but it's not a good idea to be a permissive one either. Kids need structure and rules. They need to understand what they can and can't do. They need to know how to solve problems and control their emotions. And if you aren't giving them that when they're 2, 3, 4 years old, by the time you've got a 10 or 15-year-old, you've got a nightmare on your hands. So the long and short of it is you can't be friends with your children. If you're a parent, you're a parent. You're not a friend.
Yeah.
And you have to lay down the law and teach them the social skills they need to be competent individuals.
All right. Looking at fixing the problem, abusive partners, you finally realize, or you've probably known it all along, that you do have a problem on your hands. You're not
Yeah.
living in a safe environment. Your kids are going to grow up thinking that what you've been
Yes.
exposed to is what relationships are really all about. Breaking that cycle, is it possible?
It is in some cases. I think the critical thing is this. People who are being abused, by and large, don't talk to people about it. And you can understand why, actually, because if you go and tell your mum, she's likely to say, oh, but, go and do this and go and do that and stick with it. And the same is going to be true about maybe your religious leader or maybe your friends. You're not likely to meet up with somebody who says, hang about, what you're experiencing is weird. So it's probably the best thing, if you've got any doubts at all about your relationship, is to go and talk to somebody who is professional, who's seen a lot of this sort of thing and who actually knows what the norms are and will say it out loud. Because the problem is you must actually set the barrier quite low. You mustn't say, okay, but he isn't actually hitting me. That's not the criteria.
No. Yes.
The criteria is much lower. I mean, the best criteria in my book is that you're actually not happy. You realize that there is something wrong with your relationship, but you don't know what it is. That's the key that says, a good idea to go and talk to somebody who would know. And if there are signs of abuse in the relationship, the professional will spot them in 10 seconds
Exactly.
and start talking about it.
In mentioning that, I can't help but think of a symptom of a problem in your relationship is if you're fearful.
Oh yes, that would be dreadful.
If you don't have someone to talk to and you're fearful constantly,
Yes.
you feel much better when this person isn't around. Those are already indicators that
Absolutely.
something is
I mean,
hideously wrong.
fear, I couldn't agree more, but also anxiety and also a sense of walking on eggshells, steering around topics, modifying your behavior so as not to start a row. All of that, I mean, that's loosely all called codependency. And it's typified by the person who's living with an alcoholic. You're constantly modifying your behavior and your social life and everything in order to hide it, really, which is not quite the right thing to do, is it?
Excellent. So in breaking the cycle, it is important to know that there's a problem, and we're already talking about those indicators that let you know there's a problem. You've talked about it, from the anxiety to reshaping your world.
Yes.
And I wouldn't even say walking on the eggshells. You're literally flying over things because you're scared of what the repercussions will be. So the first step is find support, somebody worth talking to.
Yes.
And I'll only put this on the table because this is the Kenya we're living in. A lady who had her hands chopped off knew she was in trouble with the man that she had married, but she went to seek help from her pastor.
Yeah.
And the word of advice was,
Yeah, I can guess.
just love him and live with him
Yeah.
and respect him. And we know how that ended.
Yes.
In looking for help, is a religious leader someone you would say go talk to in a situation like this?
It would be better than nothing. But if all you hear is, be a submissive wife and all the rest of it, then obviously you should search a little further. Some religious leaders take counselling courses. Some religious leaders have very wide experience of counselling and have encountered these things and are very sensitive. Others are dreadful, straight down the middle, and it's all, St. Paul and all the rest of it.
Right.
So you've got to be careful who you choose. I mean, there is one other avenue that you can adopt. I mean, the internet is marvellous. There are a lot of good websites on the internet run by mental health charities and lots more besides that talk about all of this sort of thing and at least give you a hint that something's wrong. So if you say to yourself, I'm feeling a bit weird in my relationship, just Google is it okay to feel afraid in my relationship? Well, instantly you'll get a big no.
Without Googling, we all said no.
But sooner or later, I think you should think in terms of talking to somebody professionally.
Okay.
And they will start evaluating whether or not it's possible to recover this situation. Because, for example, if it turns out that you're married to somebody who's got a really serious personality disorder, the advice is going to be, this isn't going to change. So we can help you manage the situation, but you are never going to be in a happy relationship, and you might like to consider leaving. Alternatively, you can see lots of reasons why the whole relationship has got very stressed up and everybody's throwing the crockery about, but we can reduce the stress.
Yeah.
And so we go back to being a normal couple. So it is possible to recover some situations, but not others.
But not others, which informs the question I was going to ask. Can somebody who's been a perpetrator change? Can
Yes, and the answer is some can.
some can?
Yeah. I mean, the classic perpetrator that can change is someone who's just started to experience far too much stress in their lives from several different directions. And some of it will be happy stress. You know, there's a new baby, a new house, a new job, and on top of that, suddenly, elderly relative dies, and all of a sudden there's a bit of stress in the relationship, and everybody's starting to walk on eggshells. Now, clearly, you can recover from that situation. But at the other extreme, if you've got someone with full-blown borderline disorder, for example, that is not going to change.
Yeah. Talking about abuse and violence, stigma, it's always fear of people knowing what's happening behind closed doors that will keep people from speaking up.
Yes.
Or even looking for support. And just listening to some of the things you said, the gaslight effect.
Yeah.
If someone's already playing with your mind,
Yeah.
it's so difficult to step
is.
out and talk to somebody or go and seek help.
Yes.
But why is it so important, and why must you go beyond the stigma to speak?
Let's just accept, first of all, that the stigma does exist. Or if it's not quite stigma, it's well-meaning but bad advice. You know, like go back and try again. The important thing is to talk to somebody who's not going to judge you. And that pretty well rules out your family and your friends. Now, if you talk to somebody who's professionally qualified in all of this, the last thing they will do is make you feel bad about what's happening. They'll actually help you sort through the evidence and decide what's actually going on and help you decide whether it's possible to do anything about it. And you know, the truth is some people do choose to stay with people with personality disorders for all sorts of reasons, but you can manage their abuse. You can actually set some boundaries up and constrain it.
Really?
Yes, but I wouldn't
Such
call that.
as?
I still
I'd like
wouldn't.
to know.
Well, for example,
What would you do?
someone with borderline
Yeah.
are prone to vast mood swings. So you can be just quietly having a lovely Saturday afternoon, and all of a sudden the guy's in a towering rage, and you're scared to death. But now, when the guy's calmed down, you can have a conversation with him, which boils down to saying, if you ever say what to me again, I shall walk out of the house and not come back for a week. And you say that more than a couple of times, and the guy will stop doing it. He will stop saying those specific things.
Isn't that more scary?
Oh,
Because he'll
it's-
find another option.
Absolutely. It's
Find
not a
something
cure.
else to do.
It's not a cure. But
Yeah.
you've sort of built a boundary wall and said, you know, if you say this to me again, I just won't listen. And building boundaries in cases like borderline does work.
Yeah.
Okay, it's not a cure.
But it gives you some kind of space.
Yeah.
Safe
And if
space.
there are really important reasons why you have to stay in the relationship,
Yeah.
then you can manage it in those sorts of ways.
Okay.
To be honest, I mean, I know I'm going to sound bad saying this. The prospect of living with somebody for 30 more years, you know, and not being happy, you know, those are the situations that make you seriously think about leaving relationships and trying again.
True. I couldn't agree more. I'm going to finish with a question for you, because there are people who choose to stay. It could be for the children. It could be for all kinds of reasons, and we've talked a little bit about that. But there is another side to why people stay, and it's very material. I once was on air, and a woman called. We were talking about violence and being beaten as a wife. And her husband had just cracked her rib. She'd just come home from the hospital, and anytime he would get physical and violent with her, he would give her a present. It would always be something quite fanciful. And so, depending on the damage done, she got everything up until, I think, one of these posh luxury cars, and she still stayed. And she said, you know,
Yeah.
it's just the way he is, and he's always very good to me after. What will you say to that woman? Because she's not alone in that box.
No.
And even that man.
Yeah, that's quite a difficult question to answer. And it actually overlaps with another group of people who stay. And the reason they stay is because they can't imagine being in a world where they're on their own,
Right.
where they actually are independent, financially independent. They've got a life of their own. Now, you can see how she's a bit like that. She loves having all this attention and all this stuff. Never crosses her mind that maybe she could get a job where she could do that for herself and she doesn't have to put up with this guy. A major reason why people don't leave is because they're in that category, that they cannot imagine being a fully independent person. And obviously, if you meet someone like that, that's the line you take, is you encourage them to think about how they could live a life which was on their terms, and where they were successful. And now they can think about leaving the relationship.
Very well said, Dr. We could talk all day
We could.
about abuse and violence, but this is just the beginning of a series of conversations on the same. And I'm hoping, you'll come back and visit and chat a little bit more
Pleasure.
to your heart's delight. But thank you for making the time to talk to us about it. But your closing thoughts on abuse and violence, the do's and the don'ts. If you experience it, what to do, what not to do. What would you like to say?
My major thought about abuse is that people shouldn't be naive. You're going into a relationship, there is always the possibility of something going wrong in a relationship. And so right from the word go, you should be watching for red flags, for not just abuse, for lots of other things, infidelity and so on.
Right.
And you shouldn't go into a relationship unless clearly they're getting a tick in every box and you are happy and you feel an independent person who is growing in the relationship. And similarly later, if abuse starts, if any form of abuse, however subtle, starts, you should grab hold of it straight away. And if you have any doubts in your mind about how to deal with it, talk to somebody who's expert in the area, because it is not something you should ever for one moment tolerate.
Ever.
And the whole idea of being in a long relationship that's unhappy like that is just too awful to think about. So you should, the moment you begin to wonder, you should talk to somebody.
Now you remember what those signs and symptoms were. In case you forgot, then the good thing about being online is you can rewind this conversation. It's all about equipping you with the tools that will help you live out loud. Thank you very much, Dr. Hart, for the time. I'm so grateful that you're here with us. Remember to subscribe to this channel. It's always great to see you. We are at Westwood Hotel and we are signing out. Before we do, a quick reminder for you to live out loud in all ways and in all things. Bye for now.